Hi, I'm Lee Fong. I'm a GP and a clinical director for GP Access After Hours and for the Hunter Medicare Local. Sorry I can't be there in person, but in lieu of that, hopefully you can bear with me through this monologue. I've been asked to share a few thoughts on the difference that the quality of clinical handover can make to the clinical journey. And I'll start by saying that I think a common way to think of the process of making a diagnosis is putting together pieces of a jigsaw puzzle of, say, an elephant. When as a GP I do that in my practice, I've got a lot of puzzle pieces gathered together from my knowledge of the patient. It's their current history of the presenting complaint, my familiarity with their appearance from previous consultations, whatever I've garnered from a current examination, relevant investigations and all that, it's all before me. And I can happily arrange those puzzle pieces and come up with the working diagnosis of an elephant. But when I'm a GP on call for a service, such as GP Access After Hours, and so I'm being rung about a patient at a nursing home, suddenly I'm in a really different position. I'm being asked to make decisions about a patient that I've never seen them before. I've never heard of them before. I can't see the patient. I've got nothing to compare their current status to. And so I'm completely and utterly dependent on the person at the other end of the telephone to give me the relevant and correct information, to give me the relevant and correct pieces of the puzzle, and to do so in an efficient and easily understandable manner. Now, I'll preface the story I'm about to tell by saying that I've had some great handovers, which have done exactly that, given me the right pieces of the puzzle in an efficient and easily digestible manner. And I've had those handovers from RNs and ACFs, but I've also had some pretty bad handovers too. And so this story is about one of the bad ones. I was a GP on call a few years ago when I got a call from an ACF, and the RN told me that they had a patient who was more confused than usual, wasn't sleeping, and really was just ringing because they wanted a telephone order for some temazepam to settle her down. When I asked the RN for more information, I think I started with what was the patient's background. Then the response I got was that the RN thought the patient had diabetes and dementia, and that's, I guess, the first point of concern, that the RN thought the patient had these things, didn't know. It sounded like they didn't have the patient history before them. Anyway, we proceeded on. I asked, what were the patient obs? Did the patient have a fever? No. A patient doesn't have a fever. Okay, great. What's the patient's blood pressure? Oh. There was a pause, and then the RN said, oh, look, the blood pressure. Blood pressure's 122 over 75. It was all sounding pretty dodgy at this point, but I persisted. What was the patient's BSL? This time, I thought I could trust the answer a bit more when the RN said, look, I just don't have that. But then what followed next was just as bad as the previous answer about that was given about the blood pressure, which was, do you really want me to go and do that? Do you really want me to go and check that? Because I'm at the other side of the nursing home from where the patient is. So if you want me to do that, I'm going to have to hang up and go and do it. And, I'll have to call you back in 10 or 15 or 20 minutes or something. That wasn't a good interaction. It was one of, if not the worst one that I've had at an ACF. And so what that interaction demonstrated was, what was somebody who wasn't giving me the key bits of a jigsaw puzzle that so that I could rapidly work out what the rest of the picture was. It wasn't somebody saying, oh, look, the things you need to be able to have to work out what this puzzle is, the bit that's got the eyes and the ears and the tusks on it. Now, instead, I was getting almost random puzzle pieces, maybe some from around the edge, maybe some from a completely different puzzle altogether, some pieces that had just been made up, and there were some bits that the person didn't even want to give me when I asked for them. And so with that quality of information, if you imagine that, being given those sorts of pieces of puzzles and then trying to put them together into one puzzle and work out what it is, what chance does one have of coming up with an accurate picture? The HCI Safe Clinical Handover document suggests that there's 3 important building blocks for improving handover. The first is building collaborative relationships, and that's between the patient, carer and clinicians. The second is to develop a shared care culture. So where you have a multidisciplinary team led by the medical home that values different views and supports bidirectional communication. And finally, it's to establish processes that include things like timely and accurate information. So really, clinical handover, if we focus on this last thing about having that timely and accurate information, well, what happens when you don't have timely and relevant communication, or if you have communication that's not accurate, that's not relevant? What's the negative impact on the patient journey? Well, I think these things are really quite obvious. If you have the wrong information, if you are given pieces of a puzzle that are irrelevant, are wrong, are inaccurate, or made up, then when you make your formulation of a diagnosis, you're going to be wrong, or at least you're not going to be entirely right. And so the decisions you make are going to be wrong or not entirely right, or in other words, suboptimal. So, for example, in this example I gave of the patient who, let's say that the patient did have hypoglycemia, then what they needed was some glucose and not temazepam. In other situations, maybe there actually is a patient who is acutely unwell, who needs investigation, who actually does need to transfer to an emergency department. And if that doesn't happen, well, then they could die. Or perhaps if that is delayed, then by the time they do get to an emergency department, then they may have a more prolonged stay with more intensive and distressing interventions that may not have been required if they'd had early intervention. What other things can go wrong? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with trust in the relationship. If you don't have trust between for example, say a GP and an RN in a nursing home, then if you can't believe the information you're being told, then you might feel compelled to go out and do a home visit. Now, that might be great for the patient, but if that didn't have to be done, that's actually an inefficiency in the system. And I think inefficiencies in the system are things which increasingly we can't afford. A lack of trust also might mean that, or the wrong information leading to the wrong diagnosis may mean that you have an unnecessary transfer for further investigation or management to an emergency department. Now, that can be bad for a whole host of reasons, not in the least because it may not be something that the patient or the family wants. But, of course, transferring aged care residents to hospital is fraught with all sorts of problems. Confusion from disorientation, delirium linked to that, falls, medication errors, all sorts of issues can compound problems that led to the call in the first place. And so when you have communication clinical handover that works really well, well, then what do you have? You have the antithesis of that. You have right decisions being made. You have whatever that might be. And the right decision might be, for example, to treat the hypoglycemia, to observe in place, to send to hospital, to keep in the ACF. You end up with an outcome, with a destination that's in the best interest of the patient, that's in alignment with what the patient and their family wishes. So in the end, I think that ISBA for aged care is an excellent tool for improving communication. There are benefits to that for ACF staff, for supporting services like GP access after hours and emergency departments, and most important of all, for the patient. ISBA for aged care, I think, is a very clear and simple way to ensure that the right bits of the puzzle get handed over to the clinician. And I'll go a little bit further than that and say that I think it can actually be more than just a tool. I hope that it can be a catalyst for building those first two building blocks that are mentioned in the ACI Safe Clinical Handover document. That is, by improving communication between ACFs and supporting services like GPAR and emergency departments, there can be an increasing environment of trust and respect. And with trust and respect, I think out of that can come real, true collaborative relationships and that shared care culture that the ACI document talks of. And I think it's once we actually get all three of those building blocks in place, we'll start to see some real lasting improvements to patient outcomes.